This week, we begin our 1-month-long look at the first of Jesus' 7 I am statements, through which he not only claims a direct connection to God, but through he also means to help people understand his saving relationship with the world. In today's gospel, John says that the day after the feeding of the 5,000, some of those who were fed came looking for Jesus. Finding him, they wanted to know if he was the Holy One of God, as some had proclaimed. What sign would he offer them as proof so that they might believe? At first, this seems kind of like a funny question to ask, doesn't it? Especially after the miracle we heard about last week. But in reality, of the 5,000 who were fed, most probably had no clue where the food they ate came from, only that it was provided. Now, those who were closest may have seen how the miracle unfolded and passed on what they witnessed to those around them. But the farther back you get in the crowd, the farther away you are from the act itself, the harder it is to believe such a wonderful statement about where this food comes from. And I suspect these are the people who come looking for Jesus, wanting to see for themselves if what they heard was really true. Now, this fits with last week's message, in which we were encouraged to do our own research to find out what is truth, so that we would not be led astray. And what better place to start to seek this truth than from the source? How many conflicts, how many misunderstandings might be avoided if we started by going to the source instead of just listening to those around us have to say? In the 3rd chapter of the epistle attributed to James, he says, "The tongue is a small part of the body, but it makes a great boast. Consider what a great forest is set on fire by such a small spark. The tongue is also a fire, a world of evil among the parts of the body. It corrupts the whole body and sets the whole course for one's life on fire, and is itself set on fire by hell. With the tongue we praise the Lord and Father, and with it we curse human beings who have been made in God's likeness. Out of the same mouth comes praise and cursing." My brothers and sisters, James says, this should not be. Can both fresh water and salt water flow from the same spring? His point: not everything we hear from someone or about someone is always true. The tongue can twist and inflame things out of spite and discontent. He goes on to say it can also inadvertently pass on false information from others, believing, or at least wanting to believe, that what it passes on is true. James will say whether it is maliciousness or gossip, we must be careful about what we say about and to one another, because it impacts our relationships with one another, and therefore our relationship with God. This is true when it comes to social media too, folks. It's amazing what some feel empowered to share or say on Facebook that they would never say face to face to someone they know. An anonymous quote that I see shared on Facebook quite frequently is worth mentioning here. Think once before you act. Think twice before you speak. And think 3 times before you post anything on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. Sound advice. Still, and I include myself here, how many of us have ever forwarded something without ever reading it first because we got it from a friend? They wouldn't steer us wrong. They've read it. Only to find out later it contains something insightful or hurtful. Or maybe it contains something that really was not factual or was only partially true. Or it may even have been just an outright exaggeration, such as professing Jesus could feed 5,000 people from 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. And you see, I suspect that's exactly what those who went searching for Jesus believed, that it was an exaggeration. Because logic dictates you cannot feed 5,000 people with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. Unless you are God. They remembered the stories passed down of their times, their people's times in the desert, when Moses fed the people with manna from God that seemed to come out of nowhere. If Jesus is who people say that he is, they would like to see a sign, like the one Moses offered, in order that they might believe. And the answer Jesus gives is one that, well, it really puzzled me a few years back. He says, don't look to him for a sign. Instead, look to God. Because it is God who offers the signs so that the people might believe. The reason this puzzled me was the church teaches that Jesus is God incarnate. So to see Jesus act means we get to see God act. It was only after I read further on back then that I came to realize that Jesus is saying, like James, that not everything we see is of God. So don't look to humanity for signs. For just as the tongue speaks the will of its master, humanity tends to occasionally, more frequently, quite often, act in accordance with its own will and not God's. Instead, we are to look to God, who through humanity will do wondrous things. Now, if Jesus would have stopped there with his explanation, his answer would have probably settled their questions. But Jesus doesn't stop there. Instead, he goes on to say, this is true about everyone out there you see, except me. I'm different, he says, in that it is not God working through me, but God who is working in your presence. I am, he says, the bread of life. As one might imagine, this begins spinning them like tops, but not near as crazy as it'll be when they hear what he says next week. You know, in this statement, he says he is the one who gives life and sustains it. They are unsure. So seeing their confusion and their dismay, Jesus helps to calm them down just a bit by saying that all who come to him, Jesus' way of saying, all who believe in me will never hunger or thirst again. Of course, when they hear this, they immediately think about our human need for food and water. But that's not what Jesus is talking about. He's hearkening back to something that was said during the Sermon on the Mount. In Matthew 5, verse 6, Jesus says, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be satisfied." Remember last week, after hearing about the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000, how did the people leave? Satisfied. Jesus says that he is the one who feeds this hunger and quenches this thirst. To know this is the work of God, all they need to do is believe in him who God has sent. Do we believe? If so, what is it we believe? These are just but two of the questions we're going to struggle with a little bit over the next few weeks as we listen to Jesus explain who he is. Here's something to think about. If we come to Jesus, if after hearing the witness that has been given, we believe him to be who he says he is, what's next? How are we to respond? Do we step out in faith? Or do we wait? Wait for more signs to help strengthen our faith before we are bold enough to step out into the world? Or do we feel that our goal has been met? So we have nothing left to do but to live our lives in the presence until we are called home to be with God. Now we might think the answer to these questions is different for each of us. But is it? What's next? Amen.